Hi, friends. So we've got the gospel reading about Lazarus today. This is Luke 16:19 to 31. And, I think Lazarus is one of those readings that we're all very familiar with. And so we hear the beginning of it and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, Lazarus, like feed the poor or something like that. And that's sort of my inclination as well when I first see this gospel reading to be like, okay, yep, we know that one. Like, we don't really need to get too much into it. And that's a really dangerous inclination. And it's really not a very Christian feeling that, especially with the stories about Jesus, we're familiar with them and so we don't need to know them better. No, I think it's the exact opposite. When we have that familiarity, then we really need to dig deeper and to see more what's going on in there. So I want to focus today on the gospel reading and I want to look at what Jesus is saying here. So he's talking to the Pharisees. And this is in Luke 16, he's been saying all kinds of things. He's talking to the disciples about the dishonest steward, which is a really tough passage. And then to the Pharisees, he says, you justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is of human esteem is an abomination in the sight of God. So they're already kind of on edge because they know that Jesus is telling them that they're not enough, that God sees their motives. He sees that they're really in it for themselves. And then he goes on. He's talking about the law. He's talking about divorce. And then he's talking about the rich man and Lazarus, right? So Jesus is talking to the disciples. He says, there was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen and dined sumptuously each day. And this, I think, is something that many of us feel very anxious about when we first hear, right? We're like, ooh, okay, like, I have some pretty nice clothes. Like, I spent a lot of money on my wedding dress. I eat pretty well. This last these last couple of months, I'm coming to you from America again. Although North, like America the continent, not America the country. I'm in Canada, but these past couple of months, as I've been traveling around, people have been feeding me all kinds of amazing and sometimes very weird food. But it's sort of this lavish experience of dining sumptuously, and it's not. I mean, I'm not going to like Ruth's Chris every night or anything like that. I'm having like fancy $6 ramen, but it is still something that I'm sort of taken aback by when I see this guy's obviously the villain, right? He's obviously the villain, and he dines sumptuously each day. And we in America, for the most part, we're dining sumptuously. Like maybe it's rice-a-roni and hot dogs or something like that, but we're eating, for the most part, what we want when we want. We're not living for months and months on beans and rice. And so, really, in this gospel, we ought to be identifying with the rich man and not with Lazarus. And the people Jesus is addressing are supposed to be identifying with the rich man and not with Lazarus. There are very few people who are going to identify with Lazarus because it says Lazarus was lying at his door. Right? I mean, this is a guy who's like so pathetic that he's just lying on the ground outside somebody's house. A poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Now, it's important to point out here, Jesus doesn't say he was there because he was lazy, or he was there because he was mooching off the state, or he was poor because, he had made terrible mistakes in his life. That's actually not at all the point. We're not supposed to ask why Lazarus is hungry. We're just supposed to feed him. And it says that he would gladly have eaten the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. And I totally understand that many of us have had an experience where you see a homeless person and you say, hey, can I buy you something to eat? And they're like, oh, I'm gluten-free, or like, oh, I don't like that restaurant or something like. And we think, oh, well, this person really just wants to buy alcohol. First of all, that's a person, right? And people get to have preferences and they get to have dietary restrictions. And sometimes we think, well, I'm doing you a favor, so you ought to be glad to eat from the scraps that fall from my table. Like, I'm doing you a favor, so here's my half-eaten box of Cheez-Its because that's all I can be bothered to give you. And like, really, friends, I give half-eaten boxes of things to homeless people all the time because it's just what I've got and it's what I'm comfortable with. But, we do need to consider that people don't necessarily want your trash. They don't want your refuse. They don't want cast-offs, when we donate to Goodwill or something, like, okay, maybe if you have real nice stuff, you're gonna consign it and give away the money. But if they've got like a toy drive to give toys to orphans somewhere, and you're like, oh, let me find the old broken stuff I don't want, or like the canned goods drive where you just go through the pantry and are like, I don't know who eats chickpeas anyway in this house. Like, we'll just give them the chickpeas. Like, no, go out and get the good stuff. Like, charity is not giving away stuff you didn't want anyway. Charity is giving until it hurts. It's giving not just from your abundance, but also from your need. And here's this rich man who doesn't do anything. I mean, dogs even used to come and lick Lazarus's sores. And the man doesn't do a thing about it. Now, this isn't just like Lazarus off in the town. This is the man at his doorstep. And I think sometimes we can be very overwhelmed by, there are so many people in need. There are so many things that I ought to be doing. Like, which one am I going to do? And so we have this paralysis because we're just overwhelmed, this compassion fatigue where we don't know who to feel sorry for and we don't know who to help, so we just don't help anybody. And I think there are a couple of responses to this. One would be to say, I've got, this amount. I've got the 10%, right? Because that's the biblical amount. 10% of my income, not necessarily your post-tax income, 10% of my income that I'm giving away. And I'm going to do research, once a month, especially if you have children, to give your kids maybe a list of charities if they're young and say, why don't you pick from these? We sometimes as a family, we would, because in my family, you would get your allowance, 10% went to charity, 10% went to savings immediately. And then every once in a while, we'd get together and you would campaign for the charity that you liked. And we would take all of our family's money for charity and we would give it to the charity that won in this campaign. So you can have your kids do something like that. You can have them go out and look for charities that really mean something to them. If you don't have kids or if your kids are too young, you can think about which headlines have really been upsetting you recently. Donate there. If it's something about the refugee crisis in like along the border with Mexico, you're thinking about like Central American refugees and South American refugees, like, okay, find Catholic charities working in those border areas and see what they need. If you're really struck by refugees from the Middle East, as I have been, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, CNEWA, is the branch of the Vatican that's working in the Middle East, boots on the ground in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine, all of these places, funding schools and hospitals with priests and nuns who are working there. You don't have to be too worried about bad choices that are being made. If you're concerned about world hunger, look at Heifer Project International, which is giving animals to people who are living in developing nations, and the understanding is that, whatever the animal is, let's say that you get a cow, the first female offspring you have to give to a neighbor. And then after that, oh, honey, I'm working on something. Bye-bye. Close the door. I'm working on something. Bye-bye. Close the door. That's Charles Etienne. He is 5 years old, and he is very excited to have a hobo in his house. You give away the first female offspring of the animal that you've given, and then that you've been given, and then after that, you've got the animal, you've got its children, you've got the milk, all that stuff. Look into something to find a charity that you really care about with it, an issue that's really tugging on your heart, and give there, and maybe look for something new the next month. Another option I think that is really important is to say, okay, I live here in this community. These are the people that I need to help. Lazarus is lying at my doorstep. So it's great to give way off there, but it's also very overwhelming because there are so many needs in the world. So I'm gonna look at my community. I'm gonna say, this is what needs to be done in my community. And I'm not just gonna give money, but I'm also gonna figure out how my gifts can serve. Like maybe I'm gonna volunteer in a soup kitchen. Maybe I'm gonna help organize things at the Crisis Pregnancy Center. Maybe I'm gonna bring my kids to visit some people at the local nursing home. Like, I'm going to be present to my community and to Lazarus, who's lying at my doorstep. But this isn't really strictly what Jesus is talking about here. I mean, he is talking about the need to serve and to help the poor and all of that. But he goes on, and let's look at what's going on with the rich man, right? So the poor man died. He was carried away by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. Notice he was not carried by angels, right? This is part of where we get that beautiful chant at the end of every funeral, may angels lead you into paradise. Really a striking prayer if you read the words. From the netherworld, where he was in torment, he raised his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side, and he cried out, Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am suffering torment from these flames. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, he knows Lazarus' name. This was not just some anonymous creature that he managed to ignore. He knows his name. He knew him personally at some level and was still able to ignore him. And now here, when Lazarus is in paradise and he's burning in hell, he sees Lazarus still as nothing, as nobody. Even knowing where his life has sent him, he's not able to recognize the gravity of that. And he still thinks that Lazarus exists to serve him and to do his bidding. And, people ask all the time, if you have this very merciful, generous understanding of God, that God is going to do whatever he can to save people. And Romans 8:32 says, he who did not spare his own son, but handed him over for us all, how will he not also give us everything else along with him? As Christians, I think we can really trust in the mercy of God, and we can hope that God's providence really offers salvation to so many people, even if they may not have known him on this earth. And people say, well, if you think that, who would ever say no? Who would ever say no to God's generosity, to God offering him salvation? And I think, well, the rich man would have said no, because he's still so cemented in his understanding of things that he can't get beyond that. He can't say, oh, I'm sorry, right? He's just so convinced that he's in the right because he's rich, he's worth something. And I think that's a big part. I mean, obviously, salvation comes from God. It's a pure, unmerited gift. We've talked about that several times in this vlog. It's kind of on my heart recently. But when we're cooperating with his grace through faith and works, a lot of that is about allowing God's grace to form our hearts in such a way that we become prepared for heaven. And the rich man isn't. And Lazarus apparently is. Not because he's poor. We don't really see why Lazarus is brought into heaven. We get a pretty good sense of the rich man that partially it's because he's ignoring the poor, and partially it's because he's so self-obsessed. He's just consumed with himself to the point that he can't even see, oh, I'm in hell, maybe I'm not the stuff. Abraham replied, my child, remember that you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus received what was bad, but now he is comforted here, whereas you are tormented. Moreover, between us and you, a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go from our side to yours or from your side to ours. Now, it's important to remember this is a parable, right? So is there actually communication between hell and heaven? My inclination would be no. This does not say that there is. This is a parable. This is not Jesus saying, this is what it looks like. Are you in the bosom of Abraham? Who knows, right? The point is that to the Jews, that would have been paradise, to be in the bosom of Abraham. And that Jesus says this man still is completely unrepentant. And Abraham says, no, you're done. Game over. You've had your judgment. It's the end. And the rich man says, then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they too come to this place of torment. Now, you do appreciate that he's concerned about his brothers. Now, it might just be sort of a family pride, because I don't think very highly of this man, but it might be that he really doesn't want them to suffer. But still, Lazarus is just a go-between. He's just a messenger. He doesn't have any dignity of himself. We're just still trying to use him, and that's something that we all need to be conscious of in our own lives, not just with the poor, with members of the opposite sex, with people who we think because of their race or because of their degree of education or because of the way in which their sin is manifest to the world. Those people don't count. Those people aren't worth anything. Those people just exist to serve me and to serve my needs. We need to be in prayer and say, Lord, where am I writing people off? Even if they deserve it, because maybe it's just a life of sin that's caused them to be in this category in my mind. And yet they are still the beloved of God. And I don't get to choose to see them only as what they can do or accomplish for me. But Abraham replied, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. He said, oh no, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, then they will repent. Some real foreshadowing here, right? Abraham said, if they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone should rise from the dead. And you do wonder, I mean, there's a lot of levels in this parable, but you do wonder if the point Jesus was making wasn't, look, if you can't recognize me because you've read Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and Genesis 22, if you can't recognize me because you've seen the way that Moses spoke about me and the way that Abraham spoke about me, if you still can't see me, it doesn't matter that I rise from the dead. You are blinded by your own ideology. And again, there's conviction there. Like maybe you recognize Jesus and maybe you love him, but is there some area in your life where your own sense of what must be true has blinded you to the grace of God who's working in your life and somebody else's life? Jesus is speaking specifically to the Pharisees here, foreshadowing, saying, look, I'm going to rise from the dead and you're still not going to get it because you're so stuck in yourselves. There's, they talk about original sin as this incurvatus in se, this curving in on yourself, this self-obsession. And I notice this particularly when I'm in airports. I notice it in other people because they're the worst. But then I notice it in myself because I'm so angry at all the other people. There was this man on the moving walkway, which first of all, it's a moving walkway, not a moving standway, so I don't know why everybody's standing still. This guy wasn't standing. He was just sauntering slower than I have ever seen anybody saunter before in my entire life. And I was so mad because he was completely ignoring all the people behind him who wanted to go. And then I was like, ooh, and I'm completely ignoring that he too is a person and deserving of respect, a person with innate dignity, even though he's sauntering at the slowest pace that is humanly possible while still actually moving. For me, that's a big thing. People who are inconsiderate or who are in my way, those people, to me, they seem like they're just objects. They're not people. And reading the parable of Lazarus is convicting to me. The rich man saw Lazarus just as what he could accomplish or as the obstacle that he was. How much am I doing that with these nameless, faceless people who I'm seeing in crowds and malls and grocery stores and airports, where I need to look at them and I need to say, this is a deeply loved child of God who deserves my love and respect. And, it's that buzzword of mine for 2017, magnanimity, this generosity of spirit that says, you know what, I'm actually not in that much of a hurry. Or I am, but I want to love you even if it means missing my flight. Or maybe I should just say, excuse me and move past you instead of loathing you from behind because I don't want to be rude. We need to keep looking at ourselves and asking, where am I, this rich man? And who is my Lazarus, who is right there in front of me and I refuse to acknowledge as the beloved of God?